Welcome to everyone to Friday Night Chats. Friday Night Chats is brought to you by the Love Family Christian Foundation, where we serve Christ Church in the community. Tonight we have on the platform Dr. Lionel Sweeny. Dr. Sweeny and I met at Judson University, where he was then director of the computer science program, the EdD, and the relationship has grown since then. So let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Sweeny. He has a 15-plus year combined experience in system engineering, program management, human resources, organizational design, and change management in government, electronics, education, and telecommunications industry. Can we say that 10 times? Responsibilities as HS partners includes leadership development, organizational design, and change support. As an accomplished HR leader with worldwide, broad-based management and generalist experience, Lionel's expertise includes building alliances to drive system-wide change strategies and performance improvement, resulting in value-added quality services to clients that impacts the bottom line. Academic experience includes Director of EdD and Computer Science for Judson University, Adjunct Instructor for Roosevelt University, the University of North Texas, Eastfield College, and Organizational Development Consultant at DePaul University. Peers consistently recognize Lionel as a practical problem solver with sound business acumen, decision-making, excellent leadership, and communication skills. Academic degrees and certifications includes a PhD in organizational development from Benedictine University, a master's degree from the University of Texas with certification in organizational design and change management, a bachelor's from the University of North Texas with concentrations in electronic design and secondary education certification, his associate's degree in electronic design and drafting, and LaMarche, an associate's managed change certification. Welcome, Dr. Sweeny.
Well, thank you. Sounds like I've been a little busy. That's a good thing.
Absolutely. Well, I'm very excited to have Dr. Sweeny here on the platform tonight because he really focused on organizational development, design, and change management. And that's not many topics you hear out in the industry, particularly with a Christian perspective. And so I wanted to just ask him a few questions to learn all about organizational development and change management and see where this discussion takes us. So feel free, Sherry and Kim, to jump in anytime and ask them questions as well. Are we good? Yes. Okay, Dr. Sweeny.
Yes, ma'am.
What is organizational development?
You know, that's a good question because a lot of the times people say you have good leadership ability. Well, that's only one component of organization development. Organization development is truly a systems approach to diagnosing the health and functionality of an organization and the people within it. So it's not just leadership. It is understanding the effectiveness of an organization and working with them to design initiatives to make them better at the end of the day.
I was excited to see you write about and even speak to the systems aspect of organizational development, because you're right, we think about leadership when we think about organization development, and that's where the impetus is, through leadership. But when you're looking at diagnosing the health of the organization, that's something completely different, because you're looking at multiple layers of what's happening within that organization. So let me ask you, what's the value of OD in the industries?
So the value of OD has three critical parts when you go in as an OD practitioner, because when you go in as a practitioner, you're going into the organization to look at it from three critical areas. The first is the alignment of leadership in the organization, not just the top level, the middle level, the bottom. How does it all work together? And then the relationships in general in the organization. The leaders may drive the organization, but for it to function effectively or toxically, the relationships have to come together. And lastly, but not least, trust factors within the organization have to align. So all of that comes under the alignment first piece. The second piece is to ensure that the system collaborate for effective communication. And I say systems because now we need to look at, in today's organizations, you have people, you have processes, you have persistent policies. Those are all systems. And when you look at organization development, you may work on one, or the problem or the opportunity may be the challenge of how you integrate them all. And lastly, but not least, organization development ensures the use of users and technology working together in what we call a social tech construction. And social tech construction is critical because prior to the 80s, when they brought technology into our organization, they brought the technology first and then they built people around it. And then you moved into AI, and AI was seen as an opportunity to replace people. When you look at a social tech organization from an OD lens, I'm looking at how do I enhance the people in the organization's opportunity to do better, perform better. That's the alignment of the systems with. So it's not AI to displace it, it's the alignment of the systems to make it better, right? So people first, system second.
Well, that was interesting. That's part of that timeline, right, with this socio-technology, because of the fact that you had the scientific management. Remember that from the old days when they were measuring the performance of the employees, and then they added the environmental, socio-cultural aspect to it to see how they would work in positive lighting or negative lighting. And then you had to focus on leadership. But I love that alignment of the AI technology. You have to include people and technology to line them together to develop the health of the organization. Right.
And I really think that's one of the things we're seeing coming out of COVID. So they look and they say we can use AI, but AI can have a bias to it. And now that's what they're finding coming out of COVID. In the insurance industry, some of the things, the programs they use are biased because when they set it up, redlining was used, right, wrong, or indifferent. And so in the system, it looks for certain zones that have been redlined. That in itself has a bias in it. So now we need to look at AI from a different lens. How do you go in and remove the bias that has already been built in? And now COVID in situations in healthcare is causing us to rethink that, right? Same thing in the housing market. We know that we had redlining, right? So those things are there. So we can talk AI, but the issue for me is when you look at AI, what you don't see is behind the scene, what's happening with the biases that were built in because of the people that built them, right?
Yeah, that was interesting. You mentioned redlining. I'm smiling because my background is in econ, and I just remember the theorists that developed a model to basically adjust a cost, an added cost for hiring either women or minorities. So if you have two qualified individuals, white and black, come to the table for the same job, the exact same job, if you hire the black man, that's the psychic cost attached to it. So that's that marginal cost. So how does that, when you see the expense, how does that impact the bottom line? So redlining, I'm so glad because Chicago used to use that model. So I'm so glad it is outlawed now.
And I don't know that people really understand how much that has an influence, even on buying and selling a house. When we relocated here from Texas, they deliberately aligned me with a buyer here or a realtor that was white. Because again, when you start looking at the pricings and the opportunity, right, wrong, or indifferent, they got a better opportunity for me. And again, they were looking to get me here. And one of the key things was cost of housing, right? Coming from Texas, I had a castle and I had to move here for a hut, but pay the castle price. Right?
Tell the truth, shame the devil. We had to do the same thing coming from Tennessee, that's for sure. Now, so what are some of the OD diagnostic tools used in assessing organizational development?
That's a very good question, because some of the OD tools for diagnosing our organization starts off with the survey method, right? That methodology is a key thing. But now we need to understand a lot of that has been digitized. So we've got the digital
Mm,
environment, but we're still doing surveys. We do them in different ways, right? And the user now has control to do a survey. What it doesn't have is when they do the surveys, the diagnostic piece has in it other OD tools that align an organization, and it's other ways or other models to make the diagnostic tool more effective. The one thing that comes to my mind is appreciative intelligence, right?
mhm.
So when we align that with a survey, I'm going into an organization to help them understand where the innovative spots are, because appreciative intelligence aligns with the conscious and unconscious mindful things we do, right? So when I build that survey, again, coming into the organization, it's critical to understand that I'm not just using a survey, but I'm using techniques from appreciative intelligence to foster conscious and unconscious decisions that'll be made. And that's why it's critical when you say diagnostic tools
Gnostic,
for
mhm.
OD. Surveys might be the general tool, but it aligns with other models like appreciative inquiry, dialogic OD, because if I want to I've got the quantitative, and then when I want to get the qualitative, I use
Qualitative.
dialogic OD in combination to go deeper into the organization, to understand the patterns and the schema. So diagnostic
Yes.
tools starts with surveys, but then it's a combination of other OD tools to diagnose and understand the organization.
Mhm. So there's a
Diagnose.
cultural component that's measured or factored in developing the health of the organization as well.
Yeah. So
Okay.
that's a good one, because culture has within it a base around ethnocentric and ethno-relative decisions. If it's ethnocentric, when you talk about the culture, it's the things you do or the decisions you make based on the way you were raised, your
Hmm.
family culture, and then you go to your community cultures. Well, when you do that, some of that has a bias or a self-centered piece into it. Now, when you become more relative in your culture and understand, you work with other cultures and you make decisions by integrating that. So that's more ethno-relative versus
Mm,
ethnocentric. And
okay.
ethnocentric is the key thing. When you're looking at culture, we got to understand that different groups and individuals bring in their different cultures. Now, when you try to build that culture for the organization, you have to understand what it looked like in the past. What did the leaders look like? Were they
Hmm.
driven or were they collaborators, right? And then you look at where you are now. So what's changed? And then the key piece after that from the OD lens says, okay, let's build out the future. But to build out the future, I got to do the past, and then I've got to reframe from the current state to the future state. So it's got to
Hmm.
have three elements to it in that diagnostic. So I love the fact that you say diagnostic tools, because the
Yeah.
tools have certain models in them from an OD lens that again goes toward driving culture and efficiencies.
Okay. Good. Now, when you say not artificial, appreciative intelligence, how is that different from positive psychology?
That's a good one. So I want to go from appreciative intelligence to appreciative inquiry,
Okay.
because appreciative inquiry is an OD tool that was a methodology that was designed in the 80s by Cooper Ryder. And his
Yeah.
whole focus was, I don't want to peel the onion apart and understand what's wrong. I want to look at the generative stuff. What's the positive stuff
Mm,
already in the organization? That's appreciative inquiry, right?
hmm.
Now, appreciative inquiry is the methodology. Appreciative intelligence is the conscious and unconscious, the cognitive piece. And you put the two together.
Okay. So how do you measure, let's see, how do I want to frame this question? In terms of culture, how do you know that the participants in the survey is really expressing their position on certain cultural factors within the organization?
That's a very good question, because what you do is in the survey, usually you ask the same question in multiple ways. And then now what you do is you go back and find the patterns and the trends, and I
Yeah.
can get closer to your true belief. Because again, within organizations, sometimes people don't trust. And when they do the survey, you're right. They answer it like they think the leadership wants them to respond. But the key thing is
Absolutely.
when you build that survey is the way you say the same thing in different ways. And then you can build from that or abstract from that, the
Okay.
patterns and the trends to get you closer to the truth.
Very good. Very good. It's a complex, it's a very complex framing that you have there. So when I'm looking as a small business owner and I have expanded out and grown over the years, what would I look for in an organizational development consultant?
That's a very good question, because in this world, you've got e-commerce and you got our traditional business strategy.
Mhm.
Most e-commerce starts out with an idea or phenomenon, and they grow it based on sales, right?
Mhm.
And volume. If you look at the traditional way, we said you needed to define a strategy. When I look at it from OD, even in e-commerce, the first thing I'm gonna go back and say, so what's your strategy? And what I'll
Mhm.
find out is a lot of the times people don't have a strategy. They may have a marketing scheme, but that's not a strategy,
Yes.
right? At the end of the day, the strategy says, this is our mission, this is our values, this is what we
Mhm.
do, right? And then you build out from that. Now in OD, you can change that. You can go to through transformation, but
Mhm.
the central thing says is I'm looking for a strategy to see how it all comes together. Now it may have morphed, or we want to morph it into something else, but
Mhm.
I need a strategy to start. Now, and the biggest problem I have is I'll get a lot of small size companies that are making profit, but to be more effective or efficient, if I can get them back to a strategy, they'd have to flush out where they want to go, right?
Mhm.
And,
Mhm.
and where their peaks and valleys are. When they don't have a strategy, you don't know that, because in the strategy, I look at competitors. I look at what I want to do. How does it look different from others? So it
Mhm.
becomes a central piece in the whole design. But again, the world today is different. And so now you find that you have to work with managers to help them understand what a strategy really is, because they
Mhm.
think it's a document, but a true strategy is a working document.
Yeah.
That means it starts at A, but it can go all the way through Z as far as modification, but you
Absolutely.
started from some point.
Mhm.
You
Uh,
know, who?
oh, go ahead.
Can I ask a quick question?
Question?
Because
Sure.
you mentioned like modification and like you said, Dr. Love, the smaller businesses and working on a new program in educational field, we said it's like a startup, right?
Right.
So when you talk about
Mhm.
organizational design, does it only apply when you're designing the organization at the startup phase, or when an organization has already had some life to it, such as our
Mm.
program? Like a lot of organizations pre-COVID,
Mhm.
during COVID, and now we're getting
And
to
post.
post-COVID.
Mhm.
One of the things that I learned from you was reframing. So you frame the organization, design the organization, and then reframing organization. So in our program, the framing was set up, and then during COVID, we had to reframe the program. And then after COVID, do you see any trends, or do you speculate any organizational design or reframing when it comes to organizations and how we're doing business, how we're conducting education, et cetera?
That's a very
Question.
good question, because I see a lot of people out there practicing what they'd say was OD, but it's not true OD, because you've hit the key piece here. You have to have an understanding of where you are so that you can reframe. Now, I can have a business going and not have a strategy, but if I come in with the OD lens to make, how do I make it more effective or efficient? I'm going to say we need to back up and do a strategy. So that just means we're going to back up, and maybe we started out in the desert, but we're going to understand why we started out in the desert. And then that'll bring us to where we are today. And with today, now I can determine if we need to reframe. And reframe means do I need to do something or can I go back and use what you've got, right? right? So the reframe is critical, but in the reframing, it does say I'm going to go back and form a strategy to align with where we are today, and then reframe to where we want to go tomorrow. But I've got to have current and past to do that from an OD lens. Now, people make changes every day. I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm saying the most efficient and effective way I know, and I believe after having over 15 years of experience now, is that you have to do that. It's not one or the other. And if I want to truly be more efficient, I have to understand who I was or what I am to go forward. That reframing becomes key. And that reframing is a part of the appreciative intelligence. That's dealing with the mind, your unconscious and conscious decisions that drive what you're going to do tomorrow. You have to deal with that in your reframing.
Dr. Sweeny, so that's a great question, because it just feeds into this question I have about the star performer. So let me just set this up for you. Kim, you might remember the scenario in Henry Cloud's book, Integrity, where you have the one individual that's a star performer in the organization, yet his character is bad. He does not work well with the team. He's doing everything independently. There's no collaborative process going on. And he knows that he's a star performer. He gets promoted for it, rewarded for it. He gets the accolades from the company. But then Henry Cloud stepped back and said, well, wait a minute. Yes, he is a star performer in terms of the revenue, but let's expense out everything he's doing. How about the number of people that have come to HR to complain about him? That takes away from the productivity. What about the job morale? What about employee engagement? All of those things were at the expense of this individual, and it wasn't acknowledged with the leaders that were higher up, because of the fact that he brought in revenues, and he didn't realize that, the company didn't realize that they were actually bleeding out based on this individual's character.
Right,
so would that be a scenario that an organizational consultant come in and address?
Right, because on the front end, that's that whole behavior piece. And we'd go back that and we'd back that into, what are your values? What do you espouse for people to do? Right? Do you want them to be truthful? And if you want them to be truthful, how do you hold them truthful if you're not true to yourself and that person, right? Because at the end of the day, yes, they're making money, but at the end of the day, how much money am I losing in the demotivation that one person shits on 10 people, right? Because that one person hits a larger number in the organization. So now I've got money associated with demotivating others in the organization. So that's one loss. The other is people, if they know this is the way the company works and rewards, guess what? They don't step up and say anything. They silently leave, especially the good workers, right? Good workers don't combat friction. They leave, right? The people that don't have a lot on their plate, don't want a lot on their plate, they stay. So at that point, for the OD problem, it would be the behavior situation, not of the person, but the acceptance of the negative behavior in the organization. So I, as an OD person, would come back in and I'd want to help understand what are the behaviors they expect for a person, right? And then now I'm going to have conversations or focus groups to understand what are the behaviors they write on the wall and the ones they live. And what you'll find is they're different because, again, that guy's a profit person, right? That person is a profit person. And it's not uncommon for that negative behavior to be allowed in the organization, which creates a toxic organization. And so as the OD person, I would come in and I would, again, want to understand what are they espoused to be versus what's actually happening in the organization. And that's where we'll start looking at, what do we do to modify that? Now, usually in that situation, they don't tell me that it's the person's profitability that's the problem. They'll say that others aren't as aggressive as that person, right? We use other adjectives, other names, but at the end of the day, I would push back and look at behavior. Now, for me as the OD practitioner, that means sometimes you'll call me in and you'll want to say it's a duck and I know it's a chicken. And so I have to help you understand I'm not the one for this, because again, what I see based on my expertise and ability to do this, you only want to recognize what your issue is, and you want me to fix something that's not broke, right?
Amen.
So that's exactly what we come in, and that's exactly what we look at. And to hold true to being an OD practitioner, I have to sometimes look at the opportunity and what the expectation is, and then based on their expectation, and after having the diagnosis, presenting it to them, if they still want to go with the other, it's up to me to say accept that job or say no, because it's not true. And in the field today, you got so many people that are practitioners. Practitioners are running after money, right? Because their job is to make a profit. Whereas me as a scholar practitioner, I'm looking for the theory and what makes it right, right? And that's not to say that I can't be one of the profit people, because that's where I grew up. That's where my practitioner work came from. But the thing that makes me a scholar practitioner is the fact that I'm not driven by the money. That's one of the things you've got to do when you look at self. You have to first look at the functionality. What are the things you can do to help the organization? Then secondly, your self-efficacy, the decisions you make and how you make those decisions are critical, because before you can get to the mastery. And where we get people or lose people is at that self-efficacy, right?
That's it. Yes. Kim, do you have a question?
You know, and
She's off
thinking
of
about
mute.
and then thinking about the case study from Dr. Cloud's book on integrity, I believe that he did consult with them. And if I'm not mistaken, the executive ended up losing his job later on. I can't remember if that was the scenario because of it. Because like you said, I think of it in the terms of the old proverb, one bad apple spoils the bunch, right? So if you have one person and you are justifying their behavior because they're helping you meet your bottom lines, but you don't recognize the toxicity and then how they're tainting the employment, the whole environment, you used a good term, because we're hearing this, people will silently quit.
Yes.
Right.
And so,
That's the whole movement now.
yes.
I'm just not gonna come work for you. I'll get something else. And that's where people want real balance now. They're not accepting as the traditional way. Right, wrong, or indifferent. We traditionally, that was a part of leadership culture. You did what you were told.
Yes.
The new world says, let's balance this together. And it's critical now that leaders are more true to thyself, right? Because again, right, wrong, or indifferent, I always say, if you got bad leaders, you're gonna have bad performance in the organization, because they're gonna model the leadership, right?
Yes.
And from an organization design standpoint, that's critical. And now we have to address that, and we have to hold leaders accountable for the behaviors in the organization.
And so as a consultant, when you go into these organizations, I was going to ask, have you been effective when you see that, the issue lies in one person's behavior or potentially their bad habits or them creating a toxic environment in the workplace? And what do you find are effective ways to communicate that to the people that hire you? Because sometimes they don't want to hear bad news, and no one definitely wants to hear that it's an environment that they potentially created by keeping this person employed at the organization.
Right. So the old me would have dissected it like it's an onion and dwell on the bad. The new me looks at the generative. What are the positive things that have happened in the organization, be it people and behavior or initiatives in the organization? And so when we look at that, the conversation we have is more around the product and not the person. I try to stay away from person and look at, what do you want to deliver? So what are your measures? What are your milestones? And if you're meeting those, then I go into behavior. So are the people in the organization behaving that way? Are the relationships positive? So at the end of the day, it's critical that on the front end, I try to finesse working around what it is versus pinpointing and hitting just the person, right?
Mhm.
So it's not the person, it's the product, right? Or the behavior.
Behavior.
And so now I may talk about the behavior, but doing the assessment, I find that it's more than one person. So I'll talk about what I've seen as far as the
Mhm.
behavior versus the expected behavior.
Right. I'm
Then we
glad
can
that you
start to
mentioned
deal
the,
with the people, because sometimes people want to deal with names, but my job is not to go in and pinpoint names. My job is to go back in and look at processes and procedures and behavior.
Yes.
you know, you and I have had discussions about that, like how to deal with false dichotomies, and it's to bring forth the data or the measurements and benchmarks, as you mentioned, because it isn't a personality contest. It's about the business's bottom line and you fulfilling your job as a consultant. So
Right.
thank you for that.
Right.
Mhm. Well, I think you answered my next question. I want you to describe your leadership style. I think I heard it in the answers, but just answer this question for me, Dr. Sweeny. Can you tell me about a time when you faced a leadership challenge? Because you've had such vast experience among really diverse industries. So that toughest leadership challenge for you.
So, and that's a very good question, because the toughest one is, when do you say enough's enough, right?
Mhm.
So, and for me, I had to grow into that, because I was raised in a family where you give it all you can. As a matter of fact, so when I left my first job, my mom says, "So why are you leaving a job?" And I told her, "It's this, it's that." She says, "That's not a reason to leave a job." But for
Mhm.
me, I have to first be true to myself, right?
Mhm.
So does what I'm doing align with my purpose? Is critical for me, right? And that's not critical for everybody. That's something that works for me. And so now when I look at my style, I want to work in environments that allow me to bring my full self. People are
Mhm.
talking about that now, but I was looking for that for quite some time, because I've always been in positions where I was the first or the second of color in the position, and it's usually one or two of us, right?
Mhm.
And so I have to deal with reality, and not the reality my mind creates. What's actually happening? What's the behavior? And I've learned now not to focus in on the person with attack, but understand the behavior and look at the counter behavior to be effective working with that person.
Mhm. So God teaches us to look at the world from 10,000 feet, right? That's the perspective. And if you're not a visionary, and if you're not willing to, accept some of the challenges, but pray for those challenges and understand the root of those challenges, then I think it would be very difficult for anyone in any industry to lead, because it's a different world today. And as you said, your mom asked, "Why did you leave?" And
Right.
with that generation, was that you stay there and do your best.
Yeah.
But now we know that we have different choices, and we have different communities and different access. So we can choose freely, but then mentally we have to know that this is a free choice. And not
Dr.
everybody knows that because they don't know their purpose.
But Dr. Lovey, and you hit a key point, free choice. And the thing I focus on now is, God gives me free will, and I live by that. He's not going to force me to do right. He's not going to force me to do anything. But at the
Right.
end of the day, the one rock he allows me to carry is free will. And so
Mhm.
with that, I try to make better choices. And I'm not saying I make the best choices. I try to make better choices.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Good. Miss Kim, you have a question?
Yeah, I think that Dr. Sweeny is very humble in talking about his leadership style, because being someone who was under his leadership, and we worked together for almost 2 years, I think that he has a very adaptive leadership style, in addition to that of a servant leader, because I just took ORL, I can't remember what it is, but
501.
leadership practices and theories.
Yes.
But as a leader, he came into the position and he sat me down. he was able to assess where I was because we were pulling a lot. And he said, you're on the verge of burnout. And I thought I was just doing what I needed to get the job done. So
Good.
he helped me to reframe in the organization. And then he had me set goals for myself. And he took it upon himself to encourage me, not just that I was a part of the organization to help the organization meet its goals, but he made sure that I received development that I needed in order to reach my goals, which that is the definition of a servant leader. Yeah. And he would remind me of, and to this day reminds me of, I know you get frustrated, but God has called you, and remember what God has called you to do as a Christian first and foremost. Yes. And that, I think he is an exemplary leader as well, in that aspect. So those are my 2 cents.
And I appreciate that, because if we go back to the servant leader, that's one that resonates with me based on my ministry work. But at the end of the day, it's corporate, it's ministry, it's all of that. Because at the end of the day, the most effective leader is the one that doesn't just direct, but the one that coaches, right? And gets in and get your hand dirty. So at the end of the day, to be an effective collaborator, a coach, a facilitator, I have to understand the work. And sometimes I have to get my hands dirty. So it's not a one job. It's a, what's the team needs to do to be successful. And so when you look at the individual, if I got one individual on my team failing, guess what? I'm failing because I haven't found out what they need to be successful. Yeah. Now, in servant leadership, again, I'm not going to make you make your choices, but we're going to be transparent about the choice you have to make. You have to make, not me, right? Because at the end of the day, here's the job, here's the description. You're going to do the work or you're not going to do the work. And you're doing the work if the goals that we set are being met, or the numbers or the measures are being met. If they're not being met, that's a different kind of conversation that we have to have, right? And now, as a part of that, I'll have that conversation, but that conversation is intended to be one we talk about, and you make a decision on what you're going to do it different. I'm not going to tell you. We're going to work on what that is. Now, once you tell me what you're going to do, guess what? In 6 months, if it hadn't changed, guess what? We're going to have the same conversation, right? So at the end of the day, you understand what it is you can do better. But again, you understand you're doing a lot of stuff, but this is the opportunity, right?
Amen. Well, I'm going to switch gears here because I know that you're doing a lot of research on palliative care and hospice research. And so just talk about that a little bit, because that's really exciting research to me, because that's where we are. When I look back over the last 2 years and the number of losses we've even had in our community or my family, and there are triggers. There are actually triggers that I experience. It's like, yeah, I need to definitely take this to God and talk to a community of people that's going through the same thing so that we can bring solutions together. So would you talk about that a bit?
You know what? And that's a key piece. When we look at that, let's start with, we have everyday triggers that roll over into that, right? And so by the time we lose somebody, we're not upset just over the loss. I've had other stuff that happened. I may have got a divorce. I may have lost other people. The dog may have died, but all of that is emotionally other pockets out there. So when you look at where am I now and what am I trying to do? I'm trying to make sure that we understand with a model around death and dying is where it starts, right? So we're going to build a grief model, but we're going to start with death and dying. Why death and dying? In the church, we talk about birth. We talk about rebirth. We talk about coming to an end, but we only talk about death when we get to the funeral. The issue is that good people don't understand when you get to the funeral, right? And the funeral takes on some of the behavior of the people that gets there. But what we have to have is understanding, what is death in the world today? What does that look like? Well, under this whole umbrella death and dying or grief ministry, I've tried to understand what are the different components out there. What makes up the holistic model? The first thing that I found out is, guess what? Nobody consistently has a conversation around death and dying, right? And now what happens is the criticalness of it happens or shows up now in today's world when people have a life-threatening disease. And there are a number out there now, Alzheimer's, heart attacks, diabetes. Those things have trends out there. And when you look out there, people end up in that situation and they start with palliative care, because palliative care says I got a disease and I'm going to try to treat it. So they're trying different treatments, right? So it's a matter of using medication and systems to bring balance. But when you get to hospice, there is no balance. You got to deal with what I know as death is not 50 years away. It may be coming tomorrow, right? But now we're not going to focus on, is it today or tomorrow? But we're going to focus on, let's understand what are the things you need now to balance your life, right? That may look different because you know some things are going to come to an end, especially with cancer. Now, the one we don't deal with cancer is, let's have the conversation. And there's two conversations, the one that's going through it and then the family, right? The person now that I know is the most important is the one that's going through it, because the family sometimes want different things, but the person going through, let's get back to that choice word, has the right to make the choice to say that, you know what, I've been doing chemotherapy for 2 years. I don't want to do it no more. That don't mean they've given up, but we have to listen with a different set of ears. That says, I'm tired of the treatment.
Yes.
Right. And if you take off your selfish hat and put their hat on, you'd understand they're not giving up. They're saying the treatment has worn me out. And I have the right, free will to say enough's enough. Now, if we put that in the religious perspective, we don't live by that anymore. We live by get the treatment. If you should help the family by getting all the treatment you need, right? But we really have to go back to making the decision, right? And what I found out in my personal life in going through this, which is critical as a part of the conversation, what do you want when it comes to the end? Well, I know I don't want to be on a respirator and I don't want tubes in me. I don't want to be in a coma. Let me go, because I'm safe and comfortable with the fact that I'll go home to be with my Lord. Now, when we get to that conversation, we may need to have another round of the conversation so I can validate that, but it's on me to validate that. It's not for you to start making choices. Now, the other key piece is their forms and things you need to sign now, because if the family says, no, we want to keep them around, start putting them on the respirator. Well, the end result is, and for me, and my thought belief is, well, maybe I'm on the respirator, the life support, but it's not going to be the same. I don't want to live like that. I have the right to make that choice. I'm not saying you agree with it. I'm saying I have the right to make the choice. Now, my wife, on the other hand, we had the conversation. She says, put me on everything. I want every day I can get. But it's okay. It's a choice. But now I'm glad we had that conversation, because again, that's not what I want, but she has a right for what she wants, right? And mine is preference. We started out with some of the things that build up first. One of the things that happens again is, so in my case, in 2016, I had a massive hematoma, right? And I don't want to go that way anymore. The thought of having to live and not having control doesn't make me feel good. That's not what I want. And I'm okay now with God gave me life. And when the end day comes, if it's 30 days, I'm okay. I don't want to shoot for the 60. Because if man says, well, if you do this treatment, we can get you another 60. Now I'm okay with it. But again, the key thing is now we have to learn how to have the conversation, because death is not just dying anymore. More people today die in the hospital or some facility versus at home. In the past, we used to die at home, but that was a choice. Now what we're dealing with is people want to keep us safe and extend our life. I'm not saying that's bad. Don't get me wrong. I'm saying we need to make sure we understand that's what the person wants. And then if the person and the family don't line up, we need to help the family have some conversation. Don't just not talk about it, because that's what we do today. We just don't talk about it, right? Because when the person starts saying, I'm ready to go, we start telling the doctors, well, let's do this, let's do this. No, do what I say. I'm not mentally impaired. I'm physically impaired. And I still have the right to make those choices. So that's the key thing that's driving me right now. That, and then working directly with my friend, Reverend Hodges, who just passed away. Again, we had some deep conversations. And now I know, after studying it and looking at it, there's a lot of stuff out there, but we need to come back and be consistent with the models we use in the church to support people around death and dying and what it looks like, because it looks totally different than I thought it was. In my head, they just get sick and they just die. Now I know that a lot of the people don't get to make the choices or have the choices they want follow through, because we put them on systems, right? And that's not fair. That's not right. But we have to have the conversation to change that, right? So when that work is, that's the key thing, is that building out in the church is a safe place to start the conversation, and then working individually with hospice and chaplains, working with individuals that may go to the church, family members, or the individual, and help them have the conversation. So at the end of the day, we're doing what they want done.
As you were talking about that, I was thinking you could team up with a psychiatrist and build a model for families and organizational development where the family is the organization, and build that model out. Yeah.
Right. See, and that's a
that.
true
It's all
trace.
about choice.
That's a true statement, because with hospice, they're using doctors and nurses that prefer to practice hospice because they believe in choice, right?
Mhm.
The majority of the doctors out there don't believe in choice. They're Hippocratic oath
Yes.
says extend life. So their first is to extend, even though that they know what they're proposing may or may not work, right?
Mhm.
But they don't give up. They want to extend life. And I'm not saying we have to give up. I'm saying we have to work with people to understand the choices they can make.
Amen.
Right.
Amen. Well, Sherry, you've been quiet. I want to give you an opportunity to speak into this conversation with Dr. Sweeny.
Well, I appreciate that. I've been just taking a number of notes, because I just recently at my job assumed some responsibilities for professional and organizational development. And up until now, the concentration has been on the professional development side in terms of learning and so forth. And now I'm wanting to take that deeper dive into organizational development and just learning some of the science behind that. I know one of the things that came to mind as you were talking, and I just know you as Reverend Sweeny. Reverend Sweeny, and some of the concepts liken them to a new business or a small business. I wondered, are there any particular best practices or profiles based on the organization? So for example, in higher education, or where there might be different collective bargaining units, or are there some best practices that would work there?
So the one that I'm going to talk about first is higher education. We teach this stuff day in, day out, but guess what? We're the worst practitioners. We don't do it, right? And so we don't use it. And so when you look at best practices, they aren't in education, number one. Number two, the best practices are starting to come out in companies. But the issue is some of the best practices are driven by profit, right? The practitioner is working for a corporation, and what they do or what they create helps them to sell a product, right? Or service. But at the end of the day, when you start doing the scholarly piece and look at how you make that more efficient, a lot of that's missing because they don't want to take the time. Now I'm a firm believer that if you take the time up front, you get a longer product run, right? Because if you don't, what you get is legal costs, you get repulls, things that have to be redone, warranty notices. All those things have a cost when you go without the organization development piece, looking at the efficiencies, the services, the processes. If you do that on the front end, I think you start to mitigate the cost and you get a better cost curve, right? When you don't do that, at the end of the day, you get something. I'm not telling you can't get something, but I believe you lose a lot of money that you could have retained. And so for small businesses, the biggest thing I see is the fact that they believe they don't need a strategy. You need a strategy. I'm not backing off of that, right? If I'm gonna have a small business, what is it gonna look like? And how does it grow? And as it grows, what are the things I do differently? Who would be my competitors or key player in that? When I do an e-commerce business and I don't have that strategy, yes, I can make some money, but am I optimizing? And that's what organization effectiveness does. It optimizes the efficiency, right? Processes, procedures, and people's behavior.
Mm. Amen. Oh, did we lose Sherry?
Yeah.
Oh, there she is.
No.
There she is.
Oh, you're mute, Sherry.
You did not lose me, thank you.
Oh.
I was trying to juggle a couple of things indiscreetly, and it ended up not being as
Okay.
discreet as I wanted it to do.
So the biggest best practice that I see that people do good is they may map out processes, but processes don't incorporate procedures and detailed procedures. I'm saying when you got multiple processes, you need some procedures to balance that out. And they do not handle behavior, right? That's the qualitative, and you don't get that in processes, right? What shows up is some of the behaviors you don't want.
And it's really interesting as you talk about not wanting to peel back the onion and people not wanting to deal with behavior and profit being the bottom line. Because one of the things we've been looking at is the 5 dysfunctions of team by Patrick Lencioni. And he talks about how important those principles are around building the trust and being able to deal effectively with conflict in a constructive way. But that piece, then we get and then commitment, but that accountability piece right before results. He contends that because there's just this focus on the bottom line, and until the unacceptable behavior affects the bottom line, and they're ready to deal with it. But until they can see the effect of the negative behavior on the bottom line, that inappropriate behavior is tolerated, because no one wants to have those difficult conversations and at the end of the day hold folks accountable. And then those things happen that you've talked about in terms of others, in the report, instructors seeing how that behavior is tolerated. So either they leave or lose all respect for leadership. And it's a very costly price to pay. I really appreciate the terminology that was used around expensing out what the tolerance of that inappropriate behavior is.
Right. And so now coming after COVID, the one thing we knew before COVID was people were demotivated. And the largest part of that was based on the leadership. People leave because of leadership, not the job. I'll tolerate the job, but I won't tolerate some of the leadership. Now we're saying we got to have managers that know how to motivate people. Well, why do you see that now? Because people have decided I'm going to leave faster, because they were already leaving. If I go look at the trends, that data is already there. So now, again, in the crisis or after the big healthcare crisis, now we want to go focus on it. But now you've got to figure out, how do you get people to trust you to have a conversation? Because you are what you are. Now, this is where that whole reframing piece is key, because now I got to deal with the unconscious thoughts or feelings they have. So how do you assess that, right? Now we go back, you've got to use the survey tools and ask the question in multiple ways to get at what their true feeling is. Because if I don't trust you, I'm not just going to give you that answer on that survey. Matter of fact, I may not take that survey. So now you got to use something like focus groups or some way to get those people in the room before they leave. Now, the balance with that is you either get them in the room before they leave or you pay the cost after they leave, right? And so if I put my business hat on, they don't want to get them in the room and pay the cost just to talk with people. Guess what? In today's world, after COVID, you're going to have to learn how to talk with me to get effective work out of me.
What was the book? Crucial Conversations?
Crucial Conversations.
Is it
Right.
Patterson?
Right.
Yes,
Patterson,
I love the
yep.
5 dysfunctions of a team, but then I preached that book to a lot of people.
Right. and
Because I know myself, I think it described was it fight or flight?
fight or flight. That's a big one.
That's me.
Right.
That's me.
And-
And I had to become mature and engage in difficult conversations because I knew the outcome was going to be for the better good.
The better good, right?
Mhm.
And in that model, it's bigger than self, right? You got to transcend
Mhm.
self. When you look at the Maslow's model, to get to that transcendence, it's
Yeah.
bigger than you. And to do that in a positive environment, it does go back to the servant leadership and doing those
Mhm.
things for the greater good. So it's a whole mind shift that leaders gonna have to be trained on, right? It doesn't just happen because they have been trained with the other models, right? And so now you got to retrain them. So it's critical that we understand that talk is good. One of the biggest things in OD now, organization development, is dialogic OD. Dialogic OD is, like I said earlier, that's nothing more than having conversations.
Yep.
And now if you notice on a lot of the TV shows, they have groups and they have large conversations. And out of that conversation, guess what? You can get the patterns and the trends of what people believe and feel.
Mhm.
That's the dialogue. That's the dialogic. That's the unconscious and subconscious stuff that we need to deal with that you're not going to get on a quantitative scale.
Right.
You're going to have to have a
It's
conversation.
qualitative. Well, that's interesting because I remember when Roger Simmons came in and he went on the listening tour, and I just trying to break down quantitatively what that would look like. My question was, well, how long is the listening tour? But what you're asserting is that is very important so that you can hear the hearts and the minds of the people so that you can build a strategy and move forward together.
Right.
And what I see now, and what I've really learned from the international students, Dr. Sweeny, and the internationals that are here, is that they have a plan before they get to the United States. They've already targeted the market. They know about the buying capital. They know about all of those things before they get here, and they execute so well. But we think as individuals, and it's hard for us to move collaboratively forward. And so that's the thing that we really have to work on. And Christians really should be able to do that together, but it doesn't always work that way. That's that trust factor.
Yes.
That's very difficult to deal with. Well, Dr. Sweeny, I have one more question for you. Who's your favorite leader? Do you have someone that inspires you, that has mentored you?
Yeah. So I used to say my favorite leader was Martin Luther King, but my favorite leader is my dad. And I learned that as I got older, and I had to preach his eulogy 2 years ago. And the one thing I told people is, my dad didn't talk to you about what you should do. My dad showed you. My dad was a doer. And so that's what I'm learning to do, is to do what you expect people to do. And guess what? When they see it in you, they'll do it, right? But now the key thing is you can't be self-centered with your doing. You have to be a giving, right? And that ties into that whole spiritual piece. You've got to know and understand your purpose as given to you by God to help others. So it's not about Lionel, it's what I do for others. That's why I say it's my dad. And at the end of the day, once I got my doctorate, my goal was to give it to him, but he passed before I got it. But at the end of the day, today's world, it's my dad. And you need to know, he wasn't flawless, but again, he did versus tell, right? And that's the key thing for me.
So this is just another question, just a random question. because it's come up in our household. Did you know which political party your parents voted for back then? Was
So
that talked about in your household?
no, they
Mine either. Mm-mm.
well, so the household was different, right? It was one of those where when my dad told you to do it, because my dad was a sergeant in the Air Force, right?
Mhm.
So when he was home, when he told you to do it, you just did it, right?
Yeah.
And so when it got to those conversations, the conversations I heard were based on what they'd already selected. We didn't have conversations about why you thought one was better than the other. And I
Mm.
never heard him and my mom have those conversations.
Mm-mm.
It was
Mm-mm.
usually right, wrong, or indifferent. Him saying this is the way we're gonna do it, and we did it. That
Yeah.
was the voting. And I'm not saying that's the way you have to do it, because today I know my sister has family meetings, right?
Mhm.
My dad, look, I wish we would have had a family meeting. But again, the key
Yeah.
thing though is when you go back to it, it was, this is what I do. And we didn't have that dialogue and I think the dialogue is rich for some, but I'm
Mhm.
okay with what I got from it, because I got more of, this is what's right, and I feel comfortable with it. But now I go back to that whole ethnocentric, ethno-relative. I'm
Mhm.
comfortable with the way we made decisions.
Mhm.
What I've learned is to be more ethno-relative and learning other cultures. And so now I know it's an expectation that people want to take a stand, an open stand of their political view. I'm one of those in the group. I won't say much. I'll nod my head because it's my personal view, and I'm not going to
Exactly.
fight with you tonight over my view.
Well, and see, I think that was the environment, because it wasn't talked about in my household. I even asked my husband, so I said, did you know? But I think they allowed us to have freedom enough to make those choices. They instilled the values in us, and especially the Christian values. And we had such a strong community of Black leaders that, provided that covering in that village. And so I was just curious about whether that was discussed in your household, because it was not in mine. But it was that freedom to choose, and based on the modeling that they had set before us.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So that's excellent. Well, all right. So what book would you recommend for us, Dr. Sweeny?
So going back to this whole OD piece, there's a book that I came across. It's called The Accidental OD Practitioner, Organization Development Practitioner.
Mhm.
And I'm working with the OD network, and I just finished it, right? And the reason I recommend it is because there's a lot of people out there with a lot of good backgrounds in engineering and medicine. Oh, sorry, but am I kidding?
No, the other way. The other way. No,
I
flip it
had
up.
it right.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yes.
So the key thing is there's a lot of people in different career options. They say they are an OD expertise, but they don't. They don't know how to combine the systems. They work with a system for a profit. When you're practicing OD, your self-efficacy is focusing on the efficiency of the person and the organization, not the cost, right? The cost is a side product, but if you do it effectively and efficiently, the cost will be there, right? So it's called the OD Accidental Practitioner, and I'm recommending that to a lot of people because, again, I meet people day in, day out that says they're OD practitioners, and I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, tell me a little about your work, and then I'll find out. Well, they may have designed something, but they didn't align the systems. They didn't look
Right.
at the relationships, right? They
Mhm.
didn't necessarily do the diagnostic on the front end, the
Mhm.
engagement of the customer. And when it came down to being transparent, they didn't always side on being transparent and letting the job go versus taking the job. It was driven by the money. They took the job, did something that they knew didn't do the best that it could have done.
Right, right.
Right.
Well, I really appreciate you taking this time to allow me to interview you. There's so much knowledge. I took a lot of notes and the conversation was great. Thanks, Kim, and thanks, Sherry, for joining us tonight. And Dr. Sweeny, I know that we'll have more conversations as you continue to build your models, multiple models and research. And I would ask that you just tell your wife, thank you for allowing us to borrow you for an hour.
I will do that. And Sherry, as you go along this arg-effectiveness piece, pick up the phone. You
Yes,
know how we
sir.
do it, right?
Yes, sir, I will do that. Thank you so much. Thanks for posting this on LinkedIn. I picked it up because I was looking for some other things and immediately wrote down the information for dialing in. So I'm glad I saw that.
Oh, absolutely. It's going to be on YouTube and on my website, and it will be on a podcast as well. So I'll put the links on LinkedIn.
Fabulous.
So nice to
thank
meet
you.
you.
Thank you, Dr. Love, for this opportunity, because again, it helps me to hone in on what I want to do. And because again, I said a book, but at the end of the day, I really want to go the podcast route, right? Because when I look at this concept of accidental OD practitioners, how do you make people more efficient? Well, you share information. And they don't know what they don't know. That's the tacit piece. I tell Kim that all the time. They don't know what they don't know. I used to say they just crazy, but I say they don't know what they don't know. And that's what I think OD can help people do, is be more effective and efficient in their business mind or business sense if they understand the OD tools and techniques they can use.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But when you're ready to set that up, let me know.
All right.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
Thanks again,
All right.
everybody.
Take care. God
Thank
bless.
you. Have a
Okay.
good
All right.
day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.